Good to go?
Am I audible? Right, so I'm Aaron Ridge. I'm Senior Render Programmer at Dambusser Studios, and this is Dan Evans-Laws. He's the Technical Art Director at Dambusser Studios. And we're going to tell you about our F.L.E.S.H system, which is the Gore system we put into Dead Island 2. Now, if you thought you were going to come and see loads of like disgusting images, you're right. This is going to have lots of gore from video games and some from films, and there is one surgery image, which Dan will warn you about beforehand if you want to close your eyes. Now I'm going to hand you over to Dan, who's going to explain what Dead Island 2 is.
Oh, okay.
Fair enough. Do that again.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Mine's all right, but yours isn't.
Yeah, you go.
Okay, cool. So, first off, what is Dead Island 2? So, I imagine if you're here, you probably already know, but for the benefit of those of you who just turned up because we had Gore in the title, it's a first-person pulp zombie action RPG built in Unreal Engine 4 that we released in April this year after a brief and trouble-free development. So, when we first were handed the project in 2018, we quickly established that it was A, a zombie game, and B, a first-person melee combat game. Now, if you've played Dead Island 1, you probably think that's quite obvious, but actually focusing in on these two things and not going too wide was key to the game's success. So we established 4 game pillars at the start. The first 2 were zombie at the core and best-in-class visceral melee combat. We also had LA as a character and pulp-inspired tone. So breaking it down a bit further, you can start to see where some of the motivation for the F.L.E.S.H system came from. It's pulp zombies. Now, if any genre is associated with excessive gore, it's the zombie genre. The pulp tone just exaggerates that further. Pulp's lurid, it's tasteless, it's trashy, but it's not disturbing. It's supposed to be exhilarating, thrilling, fun. So we wanted to push it so far that it kind of got a bit ridiculous and funny. The other thing about zombies is there tend to be a lot of them. You're going to kill hundreds, if not thousands, of zombies throughout the course of the game. We didn't want it to become visually boring, so we wanted the system to provide lots of visual variety as well. As I said, Dead Island 2 is first-person melee. What that means is that you're generally hitting things quite a lot. And if you're hitting things quite a lot, you want a lot of feedback from that. So we wanted the system to be as locationally accurate as possible to give that player feedback. We also have differing types of damage. So we've got like broken bones, dismemberments, acid damage, burning damage, and they all have different gameplay effects. So these need to be visually represented as well. And also, it's all happening right up close in front of the camera. So we needed to render it in exquisite detail on Xbox One and PS4. Now, it's time for me to disclose a vested interest here. I spent way too much of my teenage years watching trashy horror movies and playing games like Resident Evil and Doom. And so a personal goal for me was that the system would give me the same feeling of innocent, childish joy that I first experienced when I saw these things. So looking back on my misspent youth helped me sort of establish the things that really make for great gore. And while I'm going through this, just take a good look at all these clips, because there's going to be a competition at the end for whoever can name the most of these films and games. So great gore is wet, and it's bloody. It should look like it's absolutely covered in blood, and the way the light interacts with the blood needs to be right. It shouldn't look like paint. It should, look like blood. It's floppy, so it's dangly and squishy, and that secondary motion is like really important in a game like Dead Island 2. It's all about physical combat. It's layered, so you've got skin, you've got fat, you've got muscle, you've got bones, you've got internal organs, and all of these need to be represented in order to make it look convincing. Lastly, it's stretchy. Ideally, skin and tissue should kind of stretch and rip. Now, we didn't quite get there for that in Dead Island 2, but yeah, it's something we'd like to look into further. Now, I think what's interesting about this image here from Doom 2 is that just this little pixel art animation actually nails pretty much all of that. And it's something that actually, as games moved to 3D, we kind of lost a little bit. So we intended to fix that. So how did we get started? Well, the first and arguably most important task we had was to come up with a horrifically contrived acronym for the system. So we came up with F.L.E.S.H, that is the Fully Locational Evisceration System for Humanoids, which actually described our goals for the system really, really well. And the best part as well is that if we ever do like a cut down port for like Switch or mobile or something like that, we can call it F.L.E.S.H Lite. Sorry. So the early agenda was to get the F.L.E.S.H team excited. Like, we were just a team of character artists, render programmers. I'm just going to drink something. Sorry, because my mouth is dry as fuck. And we had this kind of vague idea that we wanted to make just the best Gore system that anyone had ever seen. But no one had ever done anything like that before. We didn't really know what we were doing. And we wanted to kind of align on the goals that we had for the system. So we looked at what other games did. There's a couple of pretty common approaches that people use. So one is to break the character into lots and lots of different parts and like pre-author all these nice looking wounds on the bits and then switch them out as necessary. Another approach, like in Left 4 Dead 2, is to stencil holes in the character at runtime and then fill those holes with pre-authored wounds. And the benefit of doing it that way is that you can reuse the wound meshes across lots of different character models. But neither of these really gave us the kind of accuracy and flexibility that we wanted for the system. So we also had some visual and tonal goals that we wanted to make sure everyone was aligned on as well. Now, as I said, the game should make you laugh, it shouldn't make you cry. The same goes for the reference. So we didn't go to Live Leak and watch loads of stuff that was going to traumatize us for life. We looked at lots of like practical effects from films, like say other computer games, and also large men in short ties chopping meat on YouTube. Which, if you haven't seen this guy, you have to check him out. He's incredible. So we started thinking about how we could make the damage more locationally accurate. And we came up with the idea of what we called splatter maps. So a lot of games will apply decals to characters when they get damaged. So you'll hit the character here, and it'll spawn a decal on the character. But the decal has to be attached to the character and move with it. And this can cause problems with like projection and skinning. And it also can't actually change the shape of the character model at all. So our idea was that each zombie would have a unique texture representing all the damage that had happened to it. And that rather than attaching the decals to the model, we would project these decals into the damage texture. So the way we do this is we unwrap the mesh to UV space and render that to the splatter map. Then when the zombie gets hit, we spawn a decal at the correct position, and then we use the world space position on the zombie to sample the decal texture and write that into the splatter map, which gives an accurate representation of where the damage has occurred on the zombie. So this was Aaron's first prototype that he made. Looked like this. It's just the default UV mannequin. We had a blueprint that just wrote to the splatter map, as I've just described. And then we deformed along the normal, where there was splatter. So you can see on the legs and arms here, kind of pushes inwards, looks like there's some damage. And we also blend between this kind of like skin and meat texture that Aaron made. And it's obviously, you know, it's programmer art at this point. No offense, Aaron. But Aaron did go to the trouble of painting in a little brain on the top there, which I think really helped sell the idea. And that was kind of part of the point of doing this. It earned buy-in. We needed to communicate the workings of the system to other people on the team and prove that it was worth investing in art assets. So this is the first version that we did with actual art. So we've got a proper character model, as you can see. And then inside the character model, we've got this model that we called the Meat Man, that was like a muscly, sort of skeleton-y thing. And as you deformed the outer model inwards, it went inside the Meat Man, and you ended up with that. So the approach we took here was similar to traditional decals. So you can see those sort of splatty decals that are happening when we're shooting them. And the diffuse colors in the RGB of the decal, the deformation amounts in the alpha, and we literally just wrote that diffuse color directly into the splatter map and then blended it with the diffuse texture for the zombie. But there were problems. So the decals didn't overlap that well. They just kind of stamped over each other. And also, in order to get the detail that we wanted on the decals, the splatter map needed to be really, really high res. And it's quite high res here, but even if you went close up to that zombie, it would still look a bit pixely and shit close up. So the other problem with them being high res is that makes them very, very slow to write. And they're also eating up a lot of memory. And this would be exacerbated the more zombies you added. And also, if you wanted to do other types of detailing, so normal map detail, for example, on the zombie, you'd need to write that to a separate splatter map. That would also need to be high resolution. But we really liked the idea. We could see that you had this accurate locational damage, which was really what we wanted. And changing the silhouette of the zombie really added a lot. So we had to reduce the cost, but also increase the fidelity. So these sound somewhat opposing, and they normally are. Character Art were kind of worried at this point that the procedural system wasn't going to hit the quality levels that we wanted for the game. And they were authoring some sort of high-fidelity wounds as sort of visual targets. And they baked out some diffuse normal and displacement maps from these. And we thought, well, what about if we use these as decals, but rather than writing them to the splatter texture directly, rather than writing the normals, writing the diffuse, why don't we just write the UVs that we need to look up the decal to the splatter texture, and then use those to look up the art-authored textures in the material. So this decoupled the resolution of the splatter map from the resolution of the final result. And it kind of worked. We could use a lower resolution splatter map because UVs don't need to be particularly high resolution. They're kind of, fairly gradual gradients. And then look up higher res textures in the material. But other issues persisted. We still had like stretching and overlap issues, and you could see the decals repeating quite obviously as well. But again, the idea was interesting, and we thought, what about if we kind of wrote more abstract properties of the wound into the splatter map? So rather than trying to represent the final result in the splatter map, we just write, well, this is the depth of the wound at this point. This is the amount of blood at this particular area. This is how much bruising there is there. So we tried that out, and then the idea was we'd take that data and in the character material, apply extra detail. So you can see from this video that this worked really, really well. So we could write really, really low resolution splatter maps and use them to drive these really detailed character effects in the material. Now, Character Art had authored a much better looking meat man by this point, which you can see here. And by blending through these kind of procedural fatty layers and then blending to the meat man texture and then deforming into the meat man itself, we got this really good layered look, which was exactly what we were looking for. The other thing we started to do was, rather than just deform along the normal, we would deform to a morph target. And this was to prevent issues on fingers and ears and things like that, where the vertices would stick through the other side, and make sure that when it was fully deformed, the outer mesh was tucked just inside the meat man. So before I go into any more detail about the material effects, I'll just give you an overview of sort of where we ended up with the final splatter maps. So there are several materials per zombie. We have the lower body, we have the upper body, head, hair, and then any clothing, so shorts and sandals in this case. And then each of these materials has its own unique splatter map. Now, a typical surface texture for one of these materials would be, say, 1024 by 1024 on PS4 and Xbox One, double that on Gen 9. And so that's the diffuse maps, normal maps, all of those. But the splatter map is only 128 by 128, which is really tiny, but we can still drive all those really detailed effects with it. So each channel of the splatter map represents a different property of the wound, which I can demonstrate by writing this decal to the splatter map. So we have the red channel writes depth, and that is basically just the depth of the wound. The green channel writes bloodiness, and the blue channel writes bruising. And all of these look kind of, all right on their own. But if you put them together, you get a pretty nasty looking wound, which is exactly what we were looking for. So the alpha channel of the splatter map is actually a bit special. This is a dilation mask because we have to dilate the splatter map at runtime in order to prevent UV filtering issues on the seams. So the dilation mask is just there to make sure that we don't dilate into used areas of the texture. So we've done all that, and we thought that looks pretty cool. But now the splatter maps were so small, we were like, well, we could maybe add another one and add some more stuff. So we did. We added dripping blood, and then some burnt areas, and then also water and fuel when they get spilled on the zombie. And because these decals are additive, we can just sort of add them over and over again. We're not doing alpha blending. We're just saying, OK, we're going to add more depth to the wound. We're going to add more bloodiness. And so you can just overlap them, and you just get a bigger and nastier wound, and it all looks nice. Well, not nice, but, as intended. So as we warned you earlier, this is the image that actually has some real gore in it. So if you're at all squeamish and somehow still here, please look away now. This is a picture of some surgery, and I was looking at this and also some anatomical diagrams to determine how we could do those fatty layers that blend through from the skin to the muscle. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, we've got some different layers there. You've got this kind of pinky purplish layer on the top, and then through this kind of fatty stuff that looked like baked beans, and then down to the muscle below. So this gave me the idea that we could use the depth of the wound to look up a color gradient. So yeah, the wound depth looks up that color gradient. That gives us the overall color. That worked pretty nicely, but obviously we didn't have any of that cellular detail there, which makes it look realistic. So we used a noise map to drive the U coordinate of that gradient map lookup, and then put in some other gradients across the U, and that gave us this gradient here, like a procedural gradient, which really really matched our reference. So I'm going to hide the reference again now, in case anyone was hiding their eyes. And then we just blend from the surface texture into the fatty layers, through that as the wound gets deeper and deeper, and then to the meat man texture at the end. So one problem we had with this is that we just used the character UVs to look up that tiling noise texture. And when you had a fat zombie and you did a big deep wound on it, then the character UVs would obviously stretch as they went into the wound. So to fix that, we switched to using a volumetric noise texture. And we just made a 1:8 by 1:8 by 1:8 noise texture in Houdini. It's got a different noise map in every channel. And this was really, really useful throughout development. I'd honestly recommend anyone making a game to just make one of these to begin with, because we used it for like so much stuff, including blood detailing on the environment, all kinds of things. So we also need some normals. So the trouble with just deforming the vertices in the shader is that the lighting doesn't change, so it's still lit as though it's flat. So you need to generate some normals for this. How are we going to do this? Well, if you think about it, the wound depth in the splatter map is essentially a height map of the skin. So if you've ever used Photoshop or Substance Designer to make a normal map from a height map, this is basically exactly the same thing, but we just do it in the shader or in the material. So you multi-sample the wound depth, and then you can use this normal from height map mode in Unreal to turn that into normals. And that looks like this, which is obviously, a bit flat and plasticky and shiny looking at the moment, but it gives you that shape to the wound. So then we needed to generate some detail, and we actually did this in exactly the same way. We just multi-sampled the volumetric noise and then used that to generate some gradients, which we could make normals from, and then blended the two together. And because both of those textures, the splatter map and also the volumetric noise texture, are really, really low res, this is fast enough to do on Gen 8 consoles. So bruising is really, really simple. We just have a bruise detail map. Again, it's just a tiling map. We just multiply that onto the skin surface. That's it. And because bruises have soft edges anyway, we can just use the low-res splatter map as a mask, and that's fine. Blood, though, needs a bit more of a detailed edge. We wanted this kind of splatter detail on the skin. So I borrowed a technique that you've probably encountered in terrain blending. So you've got these low-res blends on the terrain, and you want that to look a bit more detailed. You want the rocks to kind of stick up through the grass and stuff like that. So you use a height map, and you use a height lerp. And the way we did this in the splatter map is just to take the bloodiness from the splatter map, use that to drive the transition phase in a height lerp. Again, this is a standard Unreal node. And then I made this blood detail height map in Substance Designer, which is basically just a load of spatter patterns just overlaid with different values. And the resulting alpha gives you this really nice gradient where you get it's fully bloody on the right, it's fully not bloody on the left, but you've got this nice detailed edge to it, and also some variation in intensity as well, which we use to represent the blood thickness. So this is a very useful technique just generally when adding detail to low-res data, and we used it a lot in the system. So the final color for the blood is calculated using something called Beer's law. Now, Beer's law is just a way to calculate the way that light is absorbed through a translucent material. And so we can use the blood thickness and just an albedo color for the blood, which is just something we decided on. Put them through Beer's law, and you wind up with a final blood color. And the basic principle is that as the blood gets thicker, the color gets darker and more saturated, which is how things behave in real life. We then multiply the blood onto the underlying color of the zombie. And the multiplier here is really, really important if you want realistic looking blood. A lot of games, blood looks like paint, and it's because they treat it like it's a diffuse scattering material. They just use an alpha blend. So yeah, there's an example of that from a game I won't name. Looks like paint. Ours looks like blood because we multiply it on. We use Beer's law. So the normal map we use to just get the normal map detail there is just a tiling map that's pre-generated from the blood spatter detail map that I showed you in the last slide. Moving on to clothing. Clothing in our game is a separate mesh, has a separate material. And that's really good because it means that we can interpret the data from the splatter map differently. So we basically, whenever there's some splatter, we want to rip the clothes. So we just alpha out the clothes, and we use this fabric kind of tear detail mask to get that kind of raggedy edge to it. We also use a blurrier map for the blood detail to make it look like the blood's kind of soaked into the fabric a little bit. And yeah, this is, as I mentioned earlier, just a really nice thing that we can have this one splatter map and have that drive completely different effects on different materials. Hair was similar. Hair also has its own set of material effects, but it had a particular problem that no other thing did, which was if you use the hair UVs for the splatter map, then you could splatter the top of the hair where it's attached to the head, but not this part, and then you'd end up with this floating hair. So we had to fix this. And the way we did that was we mapped a second UV set for the hair strands. And the entire strand was mapped to like a single position in the second UV set on the head UVs. And what that meant was that we could use that second UV set in the hair to look up the head splatter map. So hair doesn't have its own splatter map, it just looks up the head one. And then whenever that point on the head has been splattered, the hair gets completely alphaed out. So that solved our problem. So lastly, when it comes to the surface damage, as I mentioned earlier, we've got these additive decals, and that means that we can progressively damage the surface. But it also means we can animate damage by applying low-intensity decals repeatedly over time. So that's how we did our blood drips. And we basically just use a simple gradient decal, just looks like that. We align it downwards in world space, and we just apply it with very low intensity over and over again, and it just reveals a pre-authored drip map for the zombie. Now, that would obviously be a real pain in the arse if Character Art had to do one of those for every single zombie, but fortunately, all zombies of the same type in our game share topology, they share UVs, so they just reuse the drip map across all of them. And that's about it for surface damage, so I'm going to pass you on to my colleague Aaron, who will tell you about dismemberment.
Yeah, so the splatter maps had pretty much solved surface damage. We were really happy with how this looked. But we still didn't have anything for the dismemberment. So, chopping off arms and legs from zombies is very important. So we were going to just go down the whole path of breaking up the model into lots of different pieces. That wasn't our style. We wanted something more procedural. So I'm going to show you one way you can chop zombies. And this is a technique for chopping a triangle zombie mesh with a plane, right? And you might think that sounds like a kind of performance-intensive proposition. So the important thing is trying to find a way to make this cheap. Well, step one is to run it on the GPU in the compute shader. So compute shaders are really good at doing sort of a similar thing on lots of different objects all at once. So we can write one that cuts a triangle with a plane and then run it on every single triangle in the mesh. So yeah, how do we cut a triangle with a plane? Well, this is really, really easy. You intersect the plane with the edges of the triangle. This gives you 2 intersection points. And then you make a new edge between those intersection points. And this lets you split the triangle into 3, 1 between the sort of apex and the new edge, and 2 by splitting the remaining quad in half. And then you just sort of throw away the triangle that's on the wrong side of the plane. But this is just cutting the mesh. And what you end up with is like a big hole. You can see like you've chopped an arm off, you can sort of see inside the arm, and you can see the back faces, or more likely you can't see the back faces because we call the back faces, right? So we have to come up with some way of sort of putting a cap on top of this cut. So what we've got here is we've sort of got a polygon made out of the edges that we made when we cut the triangles. So the problem is, how do we generate some triangles that fill that polygon? Well, there are like some well-known ways to do this. Like one is called ear clipping, where you sort of take the polygon and you trim off one triangle called the ear, and you like keep going. But this doesn't really make sense in the way we're talking about doing these parallel things, doing every compute shader cuts one triangle. You sort of want it to make one more triangle, maybe. So let's introduce a constraint. Let's say these holes we cut are always going to be convex. So a polygon is convex if for any 2 points inside the polygon, the line between them doesn't leave the polygon, right? So like an octagon is convex, but if you push the vert inwards until it's like that, it's concave, not convex. Yeah. So if you've got this, this is really easy to make some triangles for, right? You can just make a triangle fan. So you pick a point in the middle of the polygon, and then for every edge around the outside, you make one triangle from that edge to the point. This is really, really easy to run on a compute shader, because every edge that you're making by cutting a triangle is only making one more triangle, right? But there's a lingering question there. How do we pick that middle point? Because we've got a sort of situation where we're cutting lots of triangles all in parallel. We don't really know what the polygon is until we've done the cutting, and then it's like too late. But we can take a shortcut, right? Because we're cutting zombies, and they are character meshes. And character meshes have like an animation rig, which is made out of bones. And the bones have 3 axes. They have an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis, right? So we can take the x-axis, which in Unreal goes down the bone, and treat it as like a line in space. And then we can intersect that line with the plane we're using to cut. And this just gives you a point. And we can use that point for our triangle fan. Easy. And then obviously, we cut an arm off a zombie, and what we've got is a zombie without an arm. But you also kind of need an arm without a zombie that can drop on the floor. So to do this, you just flip the plane around, and that gives you your dismembered limb. Now, this looks great. This gives you these really nice, clean slices. However, there are issues. See, we don't really want clean. We're doing zombie violence. It's got to be all like raggedy and horrible. So how do we solve that? Well, we tessellate the cap. We use displacement maps. But these aren't great either, because we're getting these really awkward tessellations by sort of picking a fixed tessellation because we don't know what our polygon's going to be. And we end up with these really unpredictable for authoring displacement maps. And yeah, there's lots of verts there and lots of triangles, so it's using lots of memory. We also have to go back to that constraint. We said we're only going to make convex holes. Well, we have to actually enforce that somewhere. And the way we did this was we picked like these safe regions on a zombie, which are like boxes that a plane can be constrained inside that will only ever cut a convex hole. So that's quite limiting. And that's especially so for like the torso, where your bones are sort of lots of them. You don't just have one big backbone, right? So yeah, that's a bit weird. But also there's a thing with skinning, because we're making a new vertex, and the vertices in a character model have bones that they're assigned to and skin weights. So what do we pick for the skin weights for this like center point that we've made? You might think this sounds really obvious because you go, well, we're using a bone to calculate that intersection point, so let's just skin it to that bone. But that doesn't work, because then it's going to differ from the verts around the outside, and you get this horrible stretching. Okay, maybe you go really, really clever, and you're like, well, all my edges, I'm going to interpolate the skin weights and whatever, come up with something that works. This doesn't work either, because they're going to disagree across the surface of the polygon. And then your little center points are going to pull away from each other when they animate, and you get these horrible cracks. But was this good enough? We really like the splatter maps, and we liked this mesh slicing because it was like simple, fast, elegant, and I sort of thought it was clever as well. I think we could have shipped this if we'd like polished it and took it to final fidelity. But it was missing some things. One of which was that we were always going to the meat man. This was the model that Dan talked about that was like the muscle, the organs, and the bones. We deformed the skin inside this meat man, but once it got there, that was it. You couldn't actually damage the zombie anymore. We also didn't have the floppiness. We said we wanted these zombies to like jiggle around, right? We just didn't have anything for that, and the meat man wasn't very sympathetic to it anyway. And then there's also the fact that if you shoot a zombie with a shotgun, it should really blow a hole right through the zombie, shouldn't it? So this left me hunting for ideas. I really wanted to solve this shotgun problem, right? And it really bothered me. And I found inspiration when I was watching an old video of Soldier of Fortune 2, where they showed how their enemies were broken up into lots of different pieces. And I noticed this thing about the way they'd authored these pieces. They looked kind of hollow, like they had an outer surface and an inner surface with like a cavity in the middle. And this was great because when they had wounds, you could see inside the enemy or even through the enemy sometimes. And this is exactly what we wanted. So could we make this work in the context of our zombies, how they were built, in a kind of procedural way? I had a realization here. We were actually already defining two surfaces because we had the skin surface on the outside, but we also had the morph target, which we were deforming towards. These were two separate surfaces, really, right? And one was strictly inside the other at some offset, so it had some thickness. The only problem was it was like facing the wrong way because you want the inner one to face inwards, the outer one face outwards. These were both facing outwards. So let's just do that. Take a copy, but flip the faces. There you go. And that gives you a hollow model. You've got your outer surface facing outwards. You've got your inner surface facing inwards. Solved. Well, apart from the fact that you never see the actual cavity or the inner surface because the outer surface is always blocking it, right? Well, the solution to this is also really easy because we're deforming this outer surface. And at some point, it's going to meet that inner surface, right? They're going to stick together like two sheets of paper. And when they're stuck together, they seal up the mesh. And you can cut a hole in it with alpha testing. And at the point where you cut the hole, you've got a hole in the mesh. You can see inside the cavity, right? And the best bit about this is you can see the inside surface, you can see the outside surface. What you can't see is between the two layers. You can't see any back faces, right? So it's not broken. It actually looks good. Now, I explained this to Dan. I said, this is how we're going to do it. And I said, Dan, I've got this idea. I'm going to call it Reverse Man. Well, Dan, he had a better name. He called it the Kinder Egg Man. See, a Kinder Egg is kind of like this. It has two types of chocolate. It has milk chocolate on the outside, and it has white chocolate on the inside. So in this analogy, it's like the milk chocolate is the skin, and the white chocolate is the meat, if that makes sense. Here's a video sort of demonstrating this. You can see the milk chocolate deforms towards the white chocolate, and then you can open it up, and it doesn't create a hole in the mesh. You can't see inside it. It's great. So let's go and make a prototype for this. Well, I have to go to character art, and I say, can you give me the assets? Well, the assets are actually really simple. We kind of already have them, right? We just have a copy of the morph target, but we flip the faces around. And then I can make a small change to the material so that it alphas at max deformation. I take this prototype, and I put it inside our splatter editor. Now, our splatter editor, for context, was a little tool we made inside Unreal so that we could pop a zombie in it, and we could test and author kind of sets of splatter decals. And this was great for introducing variation in the spawn zombies. We could put lots of these splatter decals together and sort of pick one set of these splatter decals, which we called splatter sets. So I just took my Kinder Egg Man, and I popped him inside the splatter editor, and I put some damage on him. And this is what we got. We've got a new superpower. We can punch a hole right through a zombie. You can see inside, you can see outside, and the zombie has some thickness. And the best bit is it doesn't look broken. This was almost perfect. It was almost perfect, yeah. But the most important thing, every child knows, the most important thing about a Kinder Egg is the surprise. So what's the surprise when you crack open a Kinder Egg Man? It's guts, right? Now, at this point, we knew that our Meat Man model was kind of redundant because we were blending towards the Meat Man texture as the skin surface underwent deformation. And when it got to maximum deformation, it was almost the same shape anyway. So let's just delete the meat man, and let's alpha out this outer skin. And this gives us a wonderful cavity which we can liberally fill with viscera. This is our name for our internal organs and our bones. And we want this to be destructible, right? We want to fulfill that fantasy of blowing a hole right through a zombie. So we need to break it up into lots of little pieces. So we ended up with 23 organ and guts pieces, 7 chunks of brain, and 49 bits of skeleton. And then we could make these destructible. We made it so you could destroy viscera with impact. You could cull viscera that was on the wrong side of a plane, and you could swap viscera for a broken variant. We could also produce gibs by just taking a piece of viscera out from the main model and spawning it as a physicalized piece. So you could have your guts fall out and roll on the ground. Now, this sounds really similar to the thing we said we were going to avoid. We said we sort of didn't want to have to break up all these zombie models into lots of different pieces. But there's one big benefit in doing it this way in combination with the splatter maps and the Kinder Egg Man. We have about 350 zombies at the end of production, and that's quite a large cast of zombies for character art to author all these different broken versions of them, and it ends up with quite a lot of assets. But there's an important thing to keep in mind. We're all the same on the inside. So we have the same viscera, right? So if the zombies are more or less the same size, they can just share the viscera asset. So we only ended up with 24 viscera assets. You might also think, you said there were like 80 different pieces of viscera. Do you have to do 80 draw calls? Well, no, because they start as one draw call. You just batch them all together. And then when you remove a piece, all you're really doing is splitting that draw call in two. You've got a long run of triangles. You're taking some out of the middle. Therefore, you've got some before and some after. And you just do this every time you remove a piece of viscera. Now, what's the point of having all these giblets and bones if they don't jiggle around? We said we want our zombies to be floppy, so we hand-rolled our own soft body physics simulation. This was a F.L.E.H physics solver with some simplified primitives like tetrahedra and line chains. And then we skinned the soft body, the viscera, to these primitives so it would inherit the motion. We also made it so you could have these simplified collision planes to prevent them intersecting with each other. And having just these planes was way cheaper than actually calculating the collision. Now, having these simplified primitives, having not too many of them, and having a genius physics programmer who can make it really optimized, this ended up super efficient, which was good, because then we could add it to other things like skin. If we had a large zombie, it could have a jiggly belly. Hair, clothes like raggedy shorts, jewelry like necklaces and earrings, and also things that aren't zombies, like this flamingo. Look how happy he is, right? How long do I leave this? It's great. Right. Now, at this point, we sort of got to a realization that with the Kinder Egg Man, we could totally remove flesh from a zombie. And the viscera was kind of high enough frequency that we could cull it fairly accurately, for example, with a cutting plane. So, did we actually need all the really clever mesh slicing stuff we'd come up with? I don't think so. So, let's remove it. Instead, we just cull whole triangles. So we don't do any vertex generation, and we don't generate a cap. Then we apply some splatter as we approach the cutting plane. And the Kinder Egg Man seals this up. So you don't need a cap, because it just sort of pinches together and closes up. You get some nice material done that adds these raggedy details by alpha testing. And then you cull the viscera with exactly the same plane. And this like fills it up. It makes it look like it's still got some structural integrity. At this point, this was the chocolatey cement we needed to hold the whole F.L.E.H system together, right? It was properly gluing the two ideas of splatter maps and the dismemberment. It was a way simpler implementation than the mesh cutting, and it was less work on the GPU. We didn't have to do any wrangling of vertices or triangles, right? And it was a unified approach. We sort of just passed the same data to dismemberment as we did to surface damage. It was wonderful, and it gave great results. Look, blowing a hole right through a zombie with a shotgun. Now I'm going to hand back to Dan, and he's going to show you what it looks like in the final game.
Well, not quite in the final game first. first of all, we're going to look at some of the favorite videos that we made throughout development to show the system off. So we think we succeeded in our goal of creating a system that pushed Zombie Gore to a ridiculous new level, looked great on current generation hardware, but still ran well on last gen hardware without any significant downgrades. So it's a procedural damage system. It's fully locational. It's unified, so as Aaron just mentioned, we have the same inputs for the skin damage, the viscera damage, and the dismemberment, just decals and slice planes, essentially. And it's visually spectacular, looks convincing. Is it as good as pre-modeled Gore? I think not in every case. Like sometimes you could do a better job if you just did a bespoke pre-modeled version, but the interactivity and the dynamism of the system, I think more than makes up for that. And it's tonally correct. It was reminiscent of the over-the-top practical effects that we referenced, and it tends to make people laugh rather than cry. This is the best bit. This is my favorite one that we ever did, I think. But so, and then this is it in the final game. As you can see, we've got floppiness, bloodiness, acid melting zombies, arms breaking, zombies getting chopped in half, exploding, shot to pieces, and the now iconic fist through the skull. And you can see how this all adds to the moment-to-moment gameplay of Dead Island 2. So there are also some sort of unexpected or sort of unintended production benefits that we got from this. Having a universal system for damage meant that we could, and having a system that was high enough quality meant that all Gore in Dead Island 2 could be done using F.L.E.S.H. So that includes spawn variants. So if we've got these 350 zombie models, but then we've got sub-variants of those that are just those models with different splat sets applied. And also the Gore for cutscenes was all done using F.L.E.S.H. as well. And we just drove splat sets using like the animation timeline, essentially. It also simplified adding new weapon damage. So every time we added a new weapon, we just needed to author the F.L.E.S.H. inputs for that weapon. So we'd author some decals to show what shape the wound was going to be, and then some damage parameters about, like, is it going to break bones? Is it going to cut limbs off? That kind of thing. And then it automatically worked on every zombie in the game. So there were huge character art efficiency gains over a pre-broken system as well. Because, as Aaron mentioned earlier, we had 350 zombie models. If we'd had to have broken all of those up, it would have taken ages and ages and ages. Character art could model the zombie once, and then the F.L.E.S.H. system could do most of the rest. And another really good thing about that is that gave character art the capacity to do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of zombie models. And that was actually really important for one of our pillars, which was LA as a character, because we really wanted to represent all of the diverse sort of cultures and subcultures within LA. So, what are the meaty takeaways from this talk? Probably should have warned you about that one too. So, first off, combining simple ideas can give complex results. So we mostly used pretty well-known techniques, nothing particularly innovative really. We just combined them in novel ways and for novel purposes. We embraced low-resolution input data, so that was a real turning point when we realized that we could go, well, okay, we don't have to represent this data in a really high resolution at this point in the rendering. We can do that later, and that really, really helped develop the system. You should find the Goldilocks resolution, we called it, which was just high enough res to capture the overall shapes that you want to communicate, but low enough res that you have these nice soft gradients, because they're actually more useful when you're doing the sort of detail application in the material. Finally, put your lab coats on and experiment. We were a small cross-discipline sub-team with a sort of shared vision for what we were doing, and that was really useful because there were no production barriers for us prototyping and iterating on things. So we could go to character art, we could say, oh, we need like a new model like this, or like, can you tweak this a bit like that way? And they just say, yeah, sure, and they do it. And it meant that we could really quickly make prototypes, and that really proved out what we were doing and proved that a long R&D phase on F.L.E.S.H. was worthwhile. Avoid the sunk cost fallacy. You all heard about that before, but yeah, basically, don't worry if something doesn't work. We did loads of things that didn't really work, or they worked a bit, and you need to in order to find the things that are going to be your final answer. Arguably, we threw away the thing that was probably sort of the most clever part, which was the mesh capping. So yeah, that's it really. Thanks to the team who worked on F.L.E.S.H. and the rest of Dambuster and the Dead Island 2 team. I think it's important to say that a lot of people have said, oh, why can't you make F.L.E.S.H a plugin for other games and stuff like that? And well, not really, because it's not just art, it's not just code, it's all of those things together. And thank you very much for coming. I think we've got maybe a little bit of time for questions at the end.
You can do some questions, yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Oh.
Move out onto the stage so I can help.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, that was excellent.
Oh, thank you.
I really enjoyed F.L.E.S.H. I'm looking forward to experiencing F.L.E.S.H. I was wondering whether your marketing team had thought about including you two in like a cut-down layman's version of that explanation, because that's like, I've seen the trailers and everything, and you know, I've got friends that work on the team, but just seeing that like USP of just the Gibbs and everything, like I'm going to go buy it now. So I was wondering if they considered using you two to actually sell the game using that.
Yeah, we did a thing for IGN that was sort of that. Like there's a IGN video that's us just talking about it. Maybe not, obviously not in that much detail, but yeah. So we did get media trained, didn't we?
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Hi.
Hello.
I was wondering, did you use the F.L.E.S.H system with like RNG or another system to have zombies with pre-existing damage? So the player comes across zombies that already have an arm missing. Or
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about with the splatter sets, which we didn't go into too much detail about that here, but basically, well, we didn't randomize them exactly, because you still wanted them to look like kind of cool wounds. But the character art team could go into that splatter editor I talked about, and they could just put loads of different wounds on and save that as a splatter set. And then when we spawn zombies, it does sort of randomly pick one of those and put it on the zombie. So it takes these like 350 models, and then sometimes you don't know that two are actually the same model because they've had different splatter sets applied. So yeah, you do end up with zombies walking around with all sorts of different bits hanging off them.
And we could also tie that to behaviors as well. So if we had like a zombie with a leg missing, then it wouldn't be able to walk, and it would be like crawling towards you instead.
Nice, you answered my next question.
I'm going to switch to the next slide because you should all be like trying to figure out how many of these you can name. Because we do have a bag of Dead Island goodies. I can't remember where it is now. Hang on, here it is.
I'm going to give you a
goodies
Kinder
for the
egg,
winner.
but Dan ate the Kinder egg. So,
I did eat the Kinder egg,
yeah.
But there is some fake blood in there.
Do you want the microphone down here?
Oh.
Hi. I think I know all of them.
Wow, okay.
You've got RoboCop,
Uh-huh.
Resident Evil 3,
Yeah.
An American Werewolf in London,
Yeah.
Doom 2,
Uh-huh.
Return of the Living Dead,
Good.
Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the bottom left.
That's a hard one.
Then it's Brain Dead, Day of the Dead again, and then RoboCop.
Yeah.
Bottom left, I want to say... I'm not sure. My initial thought was Walking Dead, but no.
No.
It's
older than that.
I don't know it. I don't know it.
Okay. No. And I think we're going to have to give it to this guy. Oh, hang on.
Ooh.
I think someone might have said the right answer.
Yeah, but he got all the rest.
Yeah, okay. And you were not quite right. It's The Fly 2. But yes, very well done.
Thank you very much. I love zombies.
Yeah, good.
There you go.
You're in the right place.
Oh, yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Oh, got one here.
Hey, so yeah, awesome. I'm just wondering how you handled the physics of detached limbs and things like that. And
Oh, that's an interesting question, actually. Yeah, that's a bit problematic.
Yeah.
And I would say even in like the final version, there were still some problems. Like we basically had to. You've got the physics capsules that represent the character, and we had to just sort of split those. And what you could end up with when you split the torso in particular, you'd get a capsule at the top, a capsule at the bottom, and when you split it, then they'd intersect. And the problem with that is that obviously then they want to like ping off, you know. So yeah, we had to do a few things so that it had a bit of sort of grace time to allow them to come apart before. So yeah, that is definitely something that we want to look at for anything we do next, which would be like making sure that the physics cuts are a bit more accurate.
Neat. Thank you.
I'm just curious, did you have to, tone down some of the stuff in terms of localizing with other regions or countries, or did you get to pass all of it?
Yeah, so we didn't ship in Japan.
But we shipped in Germany, and that was like the only place where we had to do anything. And it was basically, for some reason, their requirements was that once the zombie was dead, you couldn't like maim it anymore. Which I mean, they're always dead.
They're always dead. But yeah.
Yeah.
But we didn't say that because then they'd be like, well, you can't release the game at all. Then.
You can't have any of them. No.
Yeah. Okay, we're done.
We're done.
That time, yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody.